purity culture, which is the abstinence only education, both in the public sector, but especially in the church environment, that many millennials experienced. Kept not working out, and it was the same pattern over and over and over. I was not oblivious to the pattern. What I was oblivious to was that I was the common denominator.
These myths are how I distilled all of the purity culture teachings down to these 5 categories and called them myths because they are untrue, but very, very much believed and perpetuated by purity culture.
I rewatched Mean Girls, which of course is one of the most millennial movies to exist. And the gym teacher, he's like, if you have sex, then you will die. Welcome to 40 Dates in 40 Days. I'm Sarah Beth, your host. I recently turned 40 and decided to go on 40 dates in 40 days in hopes of finding my person. I'll be documenting this in close to real time and wondering right along with you, will she meet someone? So grab your cup of tea, we are going to spill it, settle in, it is time to yap. Welcome back, everyone. It is episode 10 of 40 Dates in 40 Days. And I had pre-recorded a lot of episodes, so I haven't recorded in a while. And I feel, I don't know, I got to get back in the groove. So thank you for joining me. I am today using my college mug from Lee University. And the reason I chose this mug today is because my guest, Dr. Camden, and I knew each other in college and became good friends while she was in grad school. I worked at the university where she went to grad school. And it's just a really special episode. We're going to talk about purity culture, which if you don't know what that is, we will definitely get into it. But essentially, it is the abstinence only education, both in the public sector, but especially in the church environment, that many millennials experienced. So this is a more mature topic. I don't know that any children listen to my podcast anyway, but if so, this might be one that maybe you don't want young children to listen to. But I am excited to have Dr. Camden on. I am drinking some salted caramel tea from Bigelow Tea. Side note, I can never decide if I say caramel or caramel. I alternate. I cannot pick one. So maybe I should just take a poll and majority rule. I don't know. But salted caramel is how I'm saying it today. And I chose that tea because it also reminds me of college. Because as some of you may know, I was a French major in college and I studied abroad in France and really didn't drink anything back then. Well, anything. I didn't drink alcohol, but that's not what I meant. I didn't drink coffee or tea until I went to France, and Lipton in France has this caramel tea. See, now I switched again. This caramel tea that is just absolutely delicious, and they don't make it in the US and you can't order it. I have tried to find it. So Bigelow's version is not quite the same, but it is good. So I hope you have a good cup of tea or coffee or are enjoying your walk or getting your chores done or whatever you're doing today. Before we dive into this conversation with Dr. Camden, of course, I wanted to start with a bad date, which surprisingly, I didn't have any left over in my queue. So I will resort to one of my own, sort of. It is a bad attempt at a date that never happened. Before I get into that, just a reminder, please send in your dating stories, bad, good, or your good relationship stories so that we can commiserate or celebrate together. But my bad date story is when I first moved to Nashville, I slipped on ice, which if you've known me for a long time, you know that's not super abnormal for me, but it did happen. And so I hurt my back and I needed to go to a chiropractor. This is not the time to debate chiropractor or physical therapist or any of that. Save that for another time. But that is what I did at the time I went to a chiropractor. So I went 3 or 4 times and my back was feeling better. And so the last time I go, I thought, I'm going to ask this guy out. He was really cute. And the only reason this entered into my head is because whenever I'd go, he'd he'd sit there and chat with me. There's like this massage table thing. So he'd sit and chat with me during that. And we just had this really good rapport. One time he said, "What are you doing this weekend?" And he said, "Well, you need to find some friends who have a boat so you can go out on the lake and I can come with you." Like, that is a pretty blatant flirtation, right? So there was no doubt in my mind that he was interested. I just thought maybe he wouldn't make a move on it because of the patient doctor thing. And so I thought I'd take that off the table by making the move myself. So it's my last adjustment. And I say, "Well, I'm feeling better. I probably won't be back for a while." And I said, "So what happens next?" And he was like, "What do you mean?" And I thought we were on the same wavelength and he would pick up what I was putting down, but he didn't. So then I had to spell it out. I was like, "Well, I mean, are we going to go out?" And when I tell you all the air got sucked out of the room, it was so awkward, but I'm in too deep now. I can't backtrack. And he like starts hemming and hawing. And I was like, "What would happen? Would you get disbarred or something?" And he very awkwardly says, "Well, I think there'd be a fine." I was like, "Oh, well, then it's totally worth it." Guys, it was so awkward. And then he said, "Well, I guess I have your number." And I was like, "Well, yeah, it's on my chart, but you could ask for it," which of course he didn't. So the awkward interaction ended and I went on my day, but that is not where the story ends. Oh no. A couple months later, my back was hurting again. And I think, well, we are mature adults. I'm going to go back. He was a good chiropractor. I don't know where else to go anyway. I was pretty new to town. So I thought, well, I'm going to go back and it'll be fine. I made the last appointment of the day because that's when I could get there after work. And I walk in and no one's in the office. And I'm just looking around. He comes out of the back wearing like shorts and a t-shirt. He's like, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I had an appointment." And he goes, "Well, she forgets to write it down sometimes." Of course she does. And of course the one she forgot to write down was mine. So he goes in the back and like puts on a quarter zip. So he's kind of professional and does his thing. It was so terrible. And I'm thinking this could have been actually really romantic if you had not ruined everything the last time, buddy. So again, we go about our lives. That's the end of that, except it's not. So fast forward a few more months and I'm swiping on Bumble and I see his profile. And he had told me that it would need to be a year between when I was his patient and when we went out. So this is about 9 months later. And so we match on Bumble, which at the time, only the girl could initiate the conversation. And still to this day, you both have to match. So that means he agreed to talk to me. So we match. I send him a message and I said, "Has it been a year yet?" And again, as much as you can sense the air going out of the room through the phone, it again left the room. It was so awkward. And he was just like, "I think so." I truly think he didn't realize it was me, or maybe a lot of guys, especially when they're younger, I think just swipe really fast and then sort through it after that. So maybe that's what happened. I don't know, but it was so awkward again. So that is truly the end of that guy. Never talked to him again, never saw him again. But I did obviously then have to go to a new chiropractor much later. And so I go to this new chiropractor and he's doing my intake and he said, "Have you seen another chiropractor in Nashville?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, why'd you stop seeing that one?" I was like, "I don't know what to tell you that's true, but isn't going to creep you out." So I just said, "Oh, well, we matched on Bumble and it got awkward after that," which was true and safe thing to say. And I still see that chiropractor, the second guy. Chiropractor wise, it all worked out, but it was very uncomfortable, but one of my best stories. So there you have it, the asking out my chiropractor story. But I do have a good date to share with you that someone very special to me, I won't say who, but somebody very special to me sent in. She's one of my favorite people. And this is such a cute story. So she said, "Once upon a time in 2018, I was hanging out with a girlfriend of mine when we met up with a guy she was talking to at their apartment pool. The guy's brother was visiting from out of town, and we ended up all hanging out with them all night. We went to a wine festival, hit up a couple bars, and danced the night away. The brother and I really hit it off, so much so that he came back in town the following weekend to take me on a date. We went to Agave and Rye in Covington, Kentucky, and if you don't know anything about this place, they are known for their epic tacos. They're filled to the brim with anything and everything that you wouldn't expect to be in a taco. To say it's not the best first date place is an understatement, but I thought, whatever, I'm not going to hide how much I love tacos, and if he likes me, he won't care either. Well, the date went so well. We even had someone from another table come up to us and say, my friends and I have been watching you guys, and we can't tell if you're on a first date or if you've been together for a while. They were shocked to find out it was our first date. We took that as a great sign. Long story short, we kept dating, ended up getting married, and now have the most precious baby girl. It couldn't have been a better first date. So thank you for sharing that. That's very cute. That is also one of my favorite games to play when I'm out, is to guess which date people are on. I think I might have said that in another episode, but I love that. And I love that you fooled people. I do think that is a good sign. Obviously, in your case, it was. So thank you again for sharing. Again, please send in any of those bad date or good date stories, good relationship stories, so that I can share them. I do have a good relationship story that somebody has sent in. It's a really cute one, but I'm going to save it for another episode just in the interest of time. But keep those coming. So let's dive into this episode with Dr. Camden. We had a lot of technical difficulties in this episode. I'm not sure what was going on. It was definitely on my end. I will say that. This is not Dr. Camden's fault in any way. This was on my end, something with I use Riverside for podcasting, which I generally like. It was either with Riverside or my internet connection or both. I don't know. Unfortunately, because of that, some of this episode will be audio only. So if you're watching on YouTube or Spotify, I apologize for that, but I'm just grateful the audio did survive. But I say all that to say it's a really good conversation. And because of the technical difficulties, I forgot at least one thing that I really wanted to say, which I did hint at, but purity culture and the way it affected me, which we talk a lot more about in this episode. But one aspect of purity culture is that you only date with the intention of getting married. So if you don't see yourself marrying somebody, then there's no point in dating them. There's some good to that, I think, but it was carried to extreme, especially when you're talking to teenagers and people in their early 20s like me. And I've said this a couple times on the podcast, who are deciding if I can marry somebody based on the criteria of someone who's a teenager in their early 20s, which means they were hot and not necessarily considering what would make a good partner. Related to that, though, is I was dismissing all of these potentially good relationships. The bad ones kept not working out, and it was the same pattern over and over and over. And I will say, I was recognizing the pattern. I was not oblivious to the pattern. What I was oblivious to was that I was the common denominator. I was told by many people that no, nothing is wrong with you. God just hasn't brought the right one yet. And that was very much my mentality, because as we'll talk with purity culture, that was one of the promises. If you were good, then God would bring the right one. So the fact that I wasn't meeting the right one had nothing to do with me. It was that God hadn't brought him yet. And while I'm not trying to say there is something wrong with anyone who hasn't met the right one, I am trying to say that I should have gone to therapy sooner, because whether there was something wrong with me or not, there were definitely things that I needed to work through to better prepare myself for a relationship, to learn better boundaries, to learn better what to look for in someone else, and just to be a better partner myself. So all of that I could have learned sooner had I not had this mindset of this is something that God has promised me and will bring me in his good and perfect timing, had I instead looked more inward. And I think that is one of the biggest negatives of how purity culture personally impacted me. But we'll get into some more ways it impacted me, some ways it impacted Dr. Camden, and some ways in her practice that she has seen it impact other people. And so I think this is a really good conversation, whether you grew up in the church, whether you're just familiar with this, you've experienced it maybe from the other side as the person in the relationship who did not grow up this way. You just went to public school during the 90s and 2000s. Dr. Camden talks about President Bush and his abstinence-only education for schools. And so it was really part of the culture, even if you were not in the subculture of evangelicalism. So I think you will all find this very interesting. I hope so. So without further ado, let's get to my conversation with Dr. Camden. Welcome, everybody. I am here with Dr. Camden Morgante, who is not only a doctorate in psychology, but she is also an actual real-life friend of mine. And we are talking about purity culture today, which if you grew up in the South, if you grew up in the church, you are probably well aware of what that means. If not, Dr. Camden's going to go over it a little bit, a lot, really. We're gonna really dive into it. But I want to show her book. She is an actual expert on this topic, and I'll let her tell you more about her journey to writing this book, Recovering from Purity Culture. It's a really great read if you grew up in this subculture of Christianity, of American culture. Highly recommend it. I just can't say enough good things about it. Wherever you are in your faith journey, I think there's something that you can glean from this book, because Dr. Camden doesn't only talk about what purity culture is and the damage that has been done, but also how to heal from it from a psychological perspective. So with that said, Dr. Camden, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Sarah Beth, for inviting me. This is fun getting to talk like this in this context.
Yeah, for sure. We've never done a podcast together.
No, we have not.
Lots of beach sessions together, lots of study sessions, but never a podcast. All right, well, let's just start by, if you would just introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your path to discussing purity culture and to writing Recovering from Purity Culture and all that.
Okay. Like you said, purity culture is a part of my story growing up in the South and growing up in the conservative evangelical church. And so that was my own personal experience of growing up in purity culture and really drinking the Kool-Aid, like really buying into it and wholeheartedly embracing it. And then later on going to school to get my doctorate, becoming a therapist, and seeing how it was actually damaging to some of my clients, and then realizing how it had been damaging to me. Seeing how it affected me and my clients is what got me started doing more research and kind of critically thinking about it. And then I started writing and speaking about it online in 2020 and knew I wanted to write a book, and that, finally evolved into Recovering from Purity Culture, which was published in October of 2024. So it's been a long journey to get here, but I'm very passionate about this topic and helping people find healing from it, because it was something that many of our parents or churches had good intentions with, but just teachers maybe, but something that has really created some long-lasting and damaging effects for a lot of us.
Dr. Camden and I really share that. We are friends because we went to the same Christian college. I worked at the grad school where she got her doctorate, which was also a Christian school. So I also drank this Kool-Aid. I mean, I was in, I don't know, middle or early high school whenever I Kissed Dating Goodbye came out, which probably most people would point to as sort of the catalyst for purity culture. Again, if you're not familiar, that book, it was written by Joshua Harris, who has since renounced his early takes. I mean, how old was he, Dr. Camden? Like 22 or something?
23. Yeah, 23 when the book was published. So really too young to really impart wisdom. I'm glad nothing I wrote at 23 is out there.
Right. Gosh. Yeah. But his premise was that you should date with the intention of marriage, and really not even date, but court. Yes. So that was very much with parental involvement and with supervision, and a very different perspective from regular culture's perspective on dating. And for me, and we're going to get more into what purity culture is and the myths that you've identified, but to me, I think that intention, every date has to be pointing towards marriage, is what really messed me up and is part of why I'm doing this podcast at 40 years old. But I'm getting ahead. I will let the expert, if you could give us a brief overview of what purity culture is, and then we'll segue into the myths that you've identified from it.
I call purity culture a mostly evangelical socio-cultural political movement that peaked in the 1990s that used shame and fear as tools of control to persuade young people to abstain from sex until marriage. So if you grew up in the evangelical church in the 90s and early 2000s, you definitely heard some version of purity culture. But even if you didn't go to church, you may have heard this in school because when us millennials were in school under George W. Bush was the president, his administration, government funded abstinence only education in the public schools. So even if you had no exposure to church but were in public schools, you likely heard some sort of abstinence only education and got that message and may have gotten some of these purity culture myths too. So that's why I think it uniquely affects millennials. I have, clients who are younger than that, clients who are older who will say that they've heard some of these myths too and that they were affected. But I feel like it profoundly and uniquely affects millennials because we got it at public schools and in church and just the heyday of all the books. And there were rallies, there were purity rings, purity balls, pledges. There was a march in Washington on the National Mall. So yeah, just a lot of that socio-political stuff was going on when we were growing up.
Yeah, it's funny. On a recent flight, I rewatched Mean Girls, which of course is one of the most millennial movies to exist. And the gym teacher, which it's a joke, of course, but he's like, if you have sex, then you will die.
Right.
It is this abstinence only that is portrayed even as a joke in the movie. And yeah, I signed a pledge at some, one of the youth meetings that we all went to with our youth group. I had a ring. Now, fortunately, my parents never made me get up in front of the church and publicly affirm my virginity until marriage. I can't believe people that did that. It's so humiliating. But actually, what is so interesting about purity culture, at least the way I was exposed to it, it really wasn't so much my parents. I requested a purity ring. It was so much a part of the culture that I was in that I requested it. And I didn't live in the South at the time, but I was very immersed in church culture and youth group culture and all that. I requested to go to all these youth group conventions and so forth. This was on me. Not that my parents, they were supportive of it, of course.
Yeah.
But this was me. I was imposing all this on myself.
Yeah, I asked for a ring too, and my parents happily obliged. And they were the ones that gave me I Kiss Dating Goodbye and wanted me to follow that model and certainly encouraged youth group and got me involved in that. But I agree. I wouldn't say they were the main proponents of these myths. It was really books that I read because I was a big reader. And I think it was very attractive to those of us who are kind of like rule follower, good girl types, firstborn daughters that want to be so good and overachievers. It was very attractive because there was this set of rules to follow to be a good girl and these promised rewards if we did.
Well, that is a perfect segue into your 5 myths that you have identified and that you write about in your book. Can you take us quickly through each one of those?
Sure. So these myths are how I distilled all of the purity culture teachings down to these 5 categories and called them myths because they are untrue, but very, very much believed and perpetuated by purity culture. So the first one is the spiritual barometer myth, that your virginity or purity is a barometer or measure of your spiritual maturity in your faith. So someone who remains a virgin is a better Christian. Someone who doesn't is not a good Christian. And it really breeds a lot of pride and judgmentalism, which is something that us good girl types maybe were attracted to.
Yeah,
is kind of getting that gold star. Yeah, feeling better than other people, which was kind of the ugly downside of that myth. The second one is the fairy tale myth. This is the one that I bought into the most, that if you follow all the rules and stay pure, that God is going to give you a fairy tale husband in marriage, and it's going to happen, to your first love. You'll never get your heart broken. It's just going to be a beautiful wedding and marriage and just this whole fairy tale built up that was very attractive to me. If I can, do A, I get B. This very transactional relationship. And then the next one is the flipped switch myth. This idea that once you get married, you can flip a switch and go from complete sexual abstinence, sometimes not even kissing, to sexual pleasure and mind-blowing sex. And that is just not the case for my clients that I work with. come to me because they're having sexual problems in their marriage and sex has been frustrating and disappointing instead of exciting and pleasurable. So that's the third one. The fourth one is the gatekeepers myth, that women are the gatekeepers of sexuality, that they're the ones responsible for putting on the brakes and setting boundaries before marriage, like watching how far is too far. And then after marriage, they're the ones that are responsible for meeting the sexual needs of their husband, like constantly being sexually available to him. And so we see this breeds a lot of inequality between men and women, and sets them up, yeah, for this really unequal views about sex. And then the last one is the damaged goods myth, because if the first myth is true, that you're a better Christian if you remain a virgin, then the opposite has to be true, that if you don't, you're damaged goods. And so this is the idea that if you have premarital sex, if you go too far, or even if you're sexually abused, that you are broken and damaged, no good, and probably nobody's going to want you. So there's a lot of shame attached to that myth. So those are the 5 myths, and I gave a little explanation of what they look like later on, like the effects of them. But yeah, they're all really damaging and bring people into therapy often.
All of those I can relate to in some way. The damaged goods, and I know you talk about this in your book, there were so many analogies that were given to us. That you have a rose on the cover of your book because that was one of them. This the rose petals falling off and you're not whole anymore if you have had sex, or you're a chewed up piece of gum, or the one for me was not so much that it wasn't so much that you were a bad person, it was that you were connected to all these people. And so you gave part of your soul to every single person you had sex with, and therefore were incomplete and not giving your husband a good gift. I definitely, like you said, as the good girl, the spiritual barometer, it was always so mind-blowing to me when I would find out a friend of mine who I thought was a good Christian had sex. And I was like,
How is that possible?
I can't compute. And it was also kind of frustrating to me that I'm like, I'm doing everything I'm supposed to be doing, and you didn't and aren't still. A lot of people that now I would say I think their relationship with God was authentic and I think they were walking out their faith, but they were having sex. And I just was like, how are you doing this and living with yourself? Because I would go too far making out with a guy and feel just terrible shame. So first of all, how are you living with yourself and the guilt and the shame? And second of all, why do you get away with it and you end up finding somebody and getting married and I'm following all the rules and it's not working out for me? In fact, it's costing me a lot. And we talked about this. Dr. Camden actually interviewed me for her book. The fairy tale one was the hardest for me because I really thought if I followed all the rules, God would then give me a husband and we would live happily ever after. And I did follow all the rules and that didn't happen. And that really led to a crisis of my faith. Why is this happening?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's how I felt too. Just like I would judge other people. Like, well, they didn't follow the rules, but yet they're seeming to get these blessings. They're getting married and they have someone who loves them. Whereas I have followed the rules and haven't gotten it in the timing that I expected it to. And when I interviewed you for my book, you said something so profound that I quoted it. I feel like I upheld my end of the bargain, but God hasn't upheld his.
Yeah.
And I think so many people related to that based on the response that I've gotten from that quote, that in one way or another, maybe not the same way as you or me, but just people felt like this was a bargain that they made with God, and then it hasn't turned out how they expected.
That was my theology, is God promised it. And that was my theology beyond just marriage and relationship, but particularly related to marriage and a relationship and purity culture. And so that is one that I'm still struggling with because it really caused a crisis of faith when I hit 35 and was like, wait a minute, I've still done all the right things and this hasn't worked out. What's the problem? It can't possibly be on my end. It causes crisis of faith that I'm still grappling with.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of people's experience. A lot of people really relate to that, this feeling that it was a transaction, it was an agreement we entered into with God, that if we do our part, he'll do his. It was really a promise. And if listeners have heard of the prosperity gospel, which if you hear prosperity prosperity gospel preachers, they're the ones that say, give money to my ministry and God will bless you. And so it's usually about giving money or serving the church in some way, and God's going to give you health and wealth and happiness. And so purity culture has been called the sexual prosperity gospel because it promised sexual health and wealth and happiness if you did your part in obeying God, remaining pure. And so, so I think those are some of the really unanticipated consequences of purity culture that so many people in our generation have undergone a faith deconstruction or crisis of faith or even like religious trauma because of the teachings of purity culture.
That really ties into, honestly, my next two questions are similar. Most of us affected, as you've said, are millennials. We're in our 30s and 40s. So we're far removed from the high school youth group scenario. And yet some of us, many of us maybe, are still dealing with these lingering effects. What do you, in your practice and through your research, what are some of those lingering effects? And maybe it's the same answer. What do you see as 3 or 4 of the primary harms that were done by purity culture?
I think the 3 main categories of harms are in the categories of faith, sexuality, and relationships. So I mentioned that it can cause a crisis of faith. You mentioned that, shared that about yourself, and it definitely contributed to me too, having a lot of doubts in my faith and anger towards God when I didn't get those promised rewards in the timing that I expected. Or I mentioned religious trauma. It can cause that for people. In the category of sexuality, people can really struggle in their sex life after this, from being called damaged goods or being told this is the greatest gift you can give your spouse. But then once it's given, now what? Sometimes people have a hard time again flipping that switch. So those are some effects that I see that people really struggle in their sexual relationship or with sexual shame. And then in relationships, which is a lot of what you speak on in your podcast of dating, just a lot of people don't know how to date because they were taught not to. They were taught to court and kiss dating goodbye. There's almost can be a fear or mistrust of male-female friendships or relationships because we were taught that like you can't even be friends and every date is a potential mate. Like you were saying earlier, like you're evaluating every date or every, guy you meet or a person that of the opposite sex or whatever sex you're attracted to, you're evaluating them for their potential as a spouse or a mate. And so it really takes away from being relaxed and just enjoying those friendships. And it also harms our relationship like to ourselves, just our own body, being embodied, being able to have a relationship between your mind and body. I see a lot of mind-body disconnection in my clients. A lot of body shame. Yeah. So there's a lot of effects that can linger and that we see in our generation.
Well, one thing that my therapist and I talk a lot about is I was not allowed to make mistakes at a time when it's safe to make mistakes. You're supposed to make dating mistakes when you're a teenager because theoretically you have a safe space to land, and the stakes aren't as high. So if you mess up, if you go out with a guy who's not great, you learn from it. And I never really had those learning experiences when it was safe to have them. I had them when they were a lot higher, but I hadn't developed the skills. I hadn't developed the ability to sort through all of that because I didn't do it when I was younger.
And along with that, there's a lot of lack of self-trust. Like people don't know how to trust themselves because they weren't given those opportunities, like you said, to try new things or to make mistakes as a teenager or a young adult. So they really doubt themselves and were taught to look outside themselves for an expert to tell them what to do. Just literally told that your parents have to guide your dating decisions or that your father is the keeper of your virginity. Some people were told those kinds of extreme messages. People don't know how to trust themselves or listen and look inside themselves.
Yeah. So at the beginning, you said that a lot of this was well-intentioned, and I think that is true. And our parents are as much a product of their culture as we are of ours. So I do have some grace. Is there anything good, though, that came out of this, or was it all bad?
Certainly, anecdotally, some people will say purity culture was good for me, or it helped me avoid early sexual activity, which of course we know in the research is linked to some risk factors, or make good dating decisions. Some people did marry young to their first love and it worked out for them and they're happy. And I say, good for them. I'm happy for you. But overall, I think it caused more harm than good. And I think we have to listen to the people who are speaking up about that. And I wrote a whole book about the harms of purity culture. And there's one sentence where even I admit that there were some good things about this for me, like for me personally. And so, yeah, it's not all or nothing, but yet we just can't overlook all of the harm because some people experience some good from it. So I think it's important to listen to the variety of experiences and validate those experiences that people have.
Yeah, and you mentioned people who get married young. I hadn't really thought about that. But if you are picking your mate out of courtship at 18 or 20 years old, you might not really know what you're doing. And sometimes that can work out great, like you said. But sometimes it can really lead to catastrophic results for you, for any children that you have, when you have picked based on the wrong criteria because you were too young, you hadn't learned, because you just thought, well, this is the first person I like, therefore we have to get married. And for me, when I'm going into these dates at 20 something years old, thinking, can I marry this person? Well, the guys I'm saying, yes, I can marry, coincidentally were the hot ones. You know, I'm not thinking, is this guy really kind? Is he going to be a good father? Is he going to be a good partner? Those are things that I had not learned to look for yet. Maybe it could have worked out. And for some people, like you said, it did. And that may have a lot more to do with other factors, even their family background and how they were raised and what they're bringing into looking at a relationship. But for me personally, if I'd chosen any of those guys that I thought were great when I was in my early 20s, it would have been a disaster.
The main kind of prototypes of clients that I see, one of them is couples that got married at 20 to their first love, didn't even kiss, did nothing before they were married, and 20 years later they're seeing me with sexual problems they've struggled with the whole 2 decades they've been together. And they love each other and they're committed to each other, and so there is some emotional health and some good, relational health, but yet the sexual part is struggling. So that's one type I see a lot. Another type is a woman in her 40s who's divorced from an abusive marriage, maybe an emotionally, spiritually, or sexually abusive marriage, because she got married at 20 or 21 to that first guy, and their marriage was kind of built on this foundation of purity culture and false promises that did not turn out and led to abusive dynamics. So that's another category of clients I see. And then another would be single women in their 40s who've never been married, or 30s or 40s, and don't know how to date. Some of them have never been on a date or never kissed or just very little experiences, and they really want that, but they don't know how. And they're grieving what they have lost from these unmet dreams and expectations.
Yeah. And that's something you and I have talked about a lot, just personally, is the grief of what didn't happen. And I think that's hard for some people to understand, that grieving a dream is as real as grieving something you had that went away.
It's often like an ambiguous grief. Like other people wouldn't call it that, because it's different than the physical loss of someone, but it's the loss of a dream and expectations, the loss of what you've been working towards or what you were imagining for your life. All of us have ways maybe that our lives haven't turned out the way we expected, but there's real profound grief when you were promised that expectation and when you thought you were working to earn that, and then you don't get it. So honoring that grief is part of the healing process.
Speaking of healing, what are the first steps that you recommend to somebody who's like, this is me, whatever phase they're in? Maybe they're married, maybe they're divorced, maybe they've never been married, they've never been on a date, or they've been on 40 and 40 days. What are your first steps towards healing from this?
First, you want to start with just recognizing these beliefs. People don't always know that these are myths or put a name to that, but start to recognize those beliefs in your thinking and then start to connect them with effects in your life. Recognize, okay, because I held this belief, here's how it's affected me now in my 30s or 40s. So recognition and self-awareness is always a good first step. And then I think starting to take some steps to develop a relationship between your mind and body, if that's something you struggle with, that embodiment piece of listening to your body and feeling your feelings and emotions. That's a lot of the work that we do in therapy, is learning how to feel your emotions, acknowledge them, validate them, and how to have a relationship between your mind, body, heart, and soul. And then I would say, start to work on changing those beliefs. And a lot of times my clients will know what the correct belief is now, or they'll know these things were not true, but they can't necessarily make the change. They'll know, okay, it's okay to date for fun. Like, it's okay to just go and get to know someone. I don't have to date for marriage. But yet when you're sitting across from someone, it's hard to not have that mental checklist of like, could I marry him? You know, so actually embodying some of these new beliefs is a part of the healing process, and testing them out and having a supportive community to help you do that, or just, you know, supportive people to help you do that. So healing can be, it can be a long process depending on how deep the effects run for people or how deep the shame is for people. But there's just a lot of us speaking out about purity culture now, a lot of good resources available, and more therapists becoming aware of it. So there's definitely avenues for healing.
Thank you. When I had a dating coach on my podcast, we talked briefly about my last boyfriend and how he was kind. And she was like, I call that a redeeming experience.
Yes.
And I think, to your point, we didn't get married. That was disappointing because I really liked him, but the relationship still had a lot of value. And I'm really glad that we had it, even though the end was sad, but it was valuable. And that's something that purity culture did not teach me. There is value in getting to know a person and spending time with a person, even if they don't end up being the one you spend the rest of your life with.
Or even if your heart gets broken, there can be value in that. Or even, you know, if you have a redeeming experience, that's a beautiful thing. But even if it's not, you learn something, right? You learn from that, and it just gets you one step closer to who you want to be moving forward.
A lot of us have kids now, including you. How do we not perpetuate the cycle while still protecting our kids, helping them guard their hearts and be safe and all of that?
I think of it as like education that starts really young, instead of like this really awkward one and done sex talk, which is a lot of us had. Either we never heard about sex from our parents, or maybe we had just like this awkward one time talk. Or for me, I was handed a book and told to go off and read it. So instead of that, I think of it as like early and ongoing education with my kids, like teaching them about their bodies in a shame-free way, and talking about relationships, and just one thing building on another. We don't just have one big talk about money, or one big talk about friendship, or one big talk about faith. These are very complex topics that we're going to build on each other as they grow and develop and have new experiences. And I think the same way about dating and sex. The conversations we have now are just going to build on each other, so that when they're teenagers or when they're ready to date, that we can have more complex conversations, and that foundation's already been set. And I think as far as sexual values, thinking more in terms of values instead of do's or don'ts. Some values that, you know, listeners might consider is, you may want to teach your kids the value of consent, and, you know, learning how to give and receive consent. You may want to teach them about self-respect and respect for others. You may want to instill the value of empowerment, like you're empowered to say no, or to say yes, or to know your body. So those are all broader values than just don't have sex before marriage. That is just a very narrow, one-sided, and one-faced value, versus having a broader value of something like empowerment or respect that can apply to many more situations.
Are you taking clients for therapy or coaching?
Yeah, so I'm in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I have my private practice here. I see clients virtually too in Tennessee. And then I also have an online coaching practice where I can see clients all over the country, and in different countries. And that coaching is specifically focused on purity culture recovery and faith. And so if people are listening and really want to hone in on their faith journey and purity culture and how that's affected them, then coaching could be appropriate. If you're looking for a therapist, then you could look for my private practice and that. And then I'd love for people to pick up the book, Recovering from Purity Culture, and see how that can help them in their healing journey.
Yes. And they can follow you on Instagram at Dr. Camden.
Right. Yeah, I'm on all the socials at Dr. Camden, and my website is drcamden.com.
Yes, Dr.
Yes.
Camden. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Camden. I'm sorry that we had technical difficulties. My mother would say this was spiritual warfare, of course. Okay. Is there anything else that you'd like to share, or parting words of wisdom for those listening?
I think we said it all. Healing is possible. There's hope. And, you know, to go along with your podcast, like, dating doesn't have to be scary. It can just be a part of getting to know yourself, getting to know others, and respecting them as human beings rather than as like commodities or objects.
Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, I'm nearing the end, but I'm not at the end yet. And I am curious what my overall takeaway is going to be at the end of these 40 days. I'm losing hope that it's going to be that I found my person. But there is, like we've talked about, there is still value in the journey. And so anyway, I appreciate you being part of my personal journey as well as part of this podcast journey. And I will put all of your information in the show notes, and I just thank you for your time and for sharing all of your expertise with us.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I know it's a heavier topic than you normally address on your podcast, but I think it's really relevant as we talk about dating and singleness and navigating life in your 40s. So I hope it resonated with many of your listeners.
I think it will. So thank you so much. Thank you for joining me and Dr. Camden for that conversation about purity culture. Like she said, maybe a little heavier than some of the topics we get into, but I think it's really important and certainly has been a significant factor in my own dating journey. And so I think many of you listening can probably relate to that as well. Like I mentioned, I'll put all of Dr. Camden's information in the show notes. So be sure to give her a follow at Dr. Camden. Check out her book and other resources she has available. And if you feel like purity culture coaching would be something you could benefit from, then certainly reach out to her for that as well. Next week is another recap. I'm going to try to remember everything because this is a week that started before I went to Alaska and then continued after I went to Alaska. And my note-taking skills kind of went along with my excitement about this project. Anyway, there's some doozies in there. And I'm also going to talk about this thing called burn the haystack. If you have not heard about that, it is a rhetorical method for weeding through dating profiles. And I think you'll find it really interesting. I definitely did. So that's coming up next week. And that's it for this week. So thank you again for listening. Remember, please like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Give me a follow on Instagram. I'm not really using TikTok anymore because people are so mean there. I kept getting for some reason, my content was being pushed to angry men who like to insult strangers on the internet. I don't understand why. And as much as I want the audience for this podcast to grow, I don't want it to grow at the sake of my own mental health, and I don't need to be subjected to verbal abuse from strangers. So not using TikTok at the moment, but on YouTube and Instagram and Facebook at 40 Dates Podcast. And again, that's the number 40 at 40 Dates Podcast. And that's it. So thank you again. And as always, wish me luck.